Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on Community Choice Aggregation and the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. Thanks again for joining us. Your presenters today will be myself, Alan Hickenbottom. I'm the Oregon Project Manager for Lean Energy. And then our very special guest, Richard Engel, Director of Power Resources at the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, will be taking up the bulk of our broadcast. A couple quick housekeeping things. Today's presentation will be about 45 minutes. And if you notice to the right, you'll have a question tab over there. As we move through the presentation, please feel free to submit questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end, and then we'll also try and reach out afterwards if we can to folks to answer their questions. And also, this webinar will be recorded, and you should get a link after the conclusion of the webinar for the recorded version. Before we get started with Richard, I want to talk a little bit about Lean Energy and about CCA. Lean Energy, it's an acronym for the Local Energy Aggregation Network, is a nonprofit dedicated to the expansion and success of clean energy CCAs around the country. We work in several states in partnership with a range of organizations, public and private entities and NGOs wishing to pursue CCA in their states and communities. If you want more information, please check our website, both leanenergyus.org or more specifically for Oregon, leanenergy.org. So before we get started with Richard, let's do a quick refresher on CCA. I know many of you have seen this presentation from me a couple of times, but for those who haven't, when we talk about CCA, we quite often like to start with a little bit on the evolution of the grid. That the full stack monopoly that we're very familiar with, that started over 100 years ago, made a whole lot of sense at the time it came around. And it really did meet its goal of safe, reliable, and affordable energy for everybody. And I think we would say mission accomplished. But times have changed, technology has moved on, and we believe communities want and really can have more choice in this new environment. So enter Community Choice Aggregation, or commonly known as the shorthand CCA. It is a form of public power, much like municipals, PUDs, and co-ops. It is a form of public power, but it is not a full municipal. We also sometimes call it Muni-Light. We consider it a pro-community effort that allows utilities to continue to do what they do best. As in mind of that, transmission, distribution remain with the utility, as do they continue to provide the same services around outage support, billing, grid maintenance, and capital improvements. What passes to the CCA are the choices around power source and content, rate setting around energy prices, and then community-specific projects, which Richard will really dive into here in a bit. And again, a CCA is a public entity that allows community participation in those energy choices, be it a city, a county, or regional. From a governance standpoint, that board is derived of broadly elected public officials because we think it's very important that a CCA have that perspective in its community. But of course, like any technical agency that might be in an area, it is certainly run by energy professionals. In general, we like to talk about three primary buckets of CCA benefits. First being affordable energy bills, depending on where you are in the country. In the 8 states that have enacted CCA, we've seen anywhere from 3 to 10% average savings. But it also allows a certain amount of local rate setting based on local desires. Certainly seeing accelerated carbon reduction in the CCAs we've seen around the country from Massachusetts to California. Specifically in California, our next door neighbor, we're seeing a 50% ahead of the investor-owned utilities in carbon reduction. And in fact, many communities in California are able to get to 100% carbon-free energy this year, 2019. And in fact, we'll be doing a webinar on that in May. I'll have some details on that at the end. And then finally, a benefit that we see quite clearly is the ability for locally driven but community-specific projects, and that's in a range of areas. Economic development, local energy production, resilience. It's a long list, and we feel that these are simply not possible in today's regulatory structure. So with that, I'll turn it over to Richard. Richard Engel is the Director of Power Resources at Redwood Coast Energy Authority in Eureka, California. He oversees the administration of Community Choice, of the Community Choice Energy Program, power procurement, and customer account management. He previously worked as a research engineer at the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University in Arcata, developing hydrogen fuel cells and other advanced energy technologies. He's also worked for local government energy programs in San Francisco, Palo Alto, and Sonoma County, and he has a degree in environmental resource engineering from Humboldt State. With that, Richard, the floor is yours.
Hey, Alan, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Glad to be talking to our neighbors to the north in Oregon. Very excited about this opportunity and getting to maybe participate in some early steps towards getting CCA off the ground as a Oregon energy model. Very excited about this. As I understand it, I think that, there are a couple of reasons that that I, in particular, representing Redwood Coast Energy Authority, am talking to you this morning among all the CCAs. I just asked Allison from Lean to look up for me the latest number on how many operational CCAs there are in California as of today, and the number is 19. So there's a lot of them, and more than half of those launched in about the last 2-year period, which is about how long we've been operating. I think part of what has me talking to you today is that we're the northernmost of the CCAs and operating in an environment that that might seem more similar in some ways to Oregon and the Pacific Northwest than it is to the rest of California, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another reason I think I'm able to talk to you today and have a story to share is that we're doing a lot of innovation here and trying out some new program ideas and some new energy innovations that I think is one of the areas where we can be considered a leader in the CCA movement in California. So let's go to the next slide. Just to briefly outline what I plan to cover today, I want to talk about our organization, Redwood Coast Energy Authority. I want to give you a little bit of a profile of Humboldt County, where we operate in the northwest corner of the state. I want to talk about our particular brand of community choice energy that we're doing here. I tend to use the term community choice energy more than community choice aggregation. It just is a little more descriptive when you're talking to the people outside of our bubble of people who actually do this stuff for a living. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some specific renewable energy projects that we're developing or planning to develop or already operating here in Humboldt County. Next slide. So our CEA is a local government joint powers agency of the County of Humboldt. It includes all of the 7 incorporated cities in Humboldt County, all of the unincorporated area between the cities, and also we have the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District as a member agency. Joint powers agency is the typical framework to use for a CCA that spans across multiple city governments and unincorporated county areas. There are also some CCAs that are just serving a single city, so they just operate within that city government framework and don't need to create a JPA. We were established in 2003, so as an organization, we're much older than our sister CCAs in California. The reason we were established in 2003, that was shortly after the California energy crisis, the big meltdown with Enron and everything, where we saw crazy spikes in wholesale and retail energy costs in the state, and just a lot of chaos and discomfort for California electricity users. We were one of a few local governments that set up dedicated energy offices. So we were set up as a JPA back then, and we worked mainly in the energy efficiency space for our first few years. Part of that has been working in partnership with our local investor-owned utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, operating a program called Redwood Coast Energy Watch. There are a number of these Energy Watch partnerships within PG&E's service area across northern and central California. And it's typically a JPA like ours, or sometimes a city or county government that's working with PG&E using dedicated funds that are collected through monthly electricity bills that are turned around and invested in energy efficiency programs for the community. We've also gotten into the clean transportation arena, mainly through establishing a network of publicly owned EV charging stations across the county, so people with electric vehicles are able to charge more easily when they're away from home. And we've gotten into some other things that aren't listed here, like doing climate action planning with our member agency governments. The electricity supply part, the CCA, launched fairly recently in May 2017, so we're coming up on our 2nd anniversary of that. Next slide. Okay, so this is a map of Humboldt County, and I've added some icons to it that sort of highlight the mainstays of our local economy. It is a pretty diverse rural economy. We've got 135,000 people. Geographically, we're pretty isolated from the rest of the state. You know, if you want to ride an escalator, you have to drive at least 3 or 4 hours from Humboldt County. You know, we're small town. The county seat, Eureka, only has 20-something thousand people. It's about a 5 or 6 hour drive from Eureka to San Francisco, and a similar distance to get to the state capital, Sacramento. And we frequently have power outages. We frequently have road closures due to landslides north, south, and east of us. So there are times when we're physically really isolated from the rest of the state, and there are energy challenges that go with that. We have high levels of poverty and unemployment. Out of the 58 counties in the state, we have the 8th lowest median household income. Now, some of the early leaders on community choice energy, Marin County and Santa Clara County, where Silicon Valley Clean Energy is located. Those 2 counties, Marin and Santa Clara, are the 2 highest median household incomes in the state. So looking to them as models for what was possible in Humboldt County was of somewhat limited use because our circumstances are so different here. Looking at the icons I put on the map, the little cap and gown in the middle of the map represents Humboldt State University in Arcata. That's a college town, like many college towns, a liberal leaning place, high levels of environmental awareness, a little bit more affluent than the rest of the county. So that's one of our economic mainstays. You know, it's a small state university, but big enough that it makes a big impact on our local economy and does provide a lot of direct and indirect jobs. The cannabis leaves in the eastern and southern parts of the county represent a really important part of Humboldt County's story. You know, we have a well-established reputation as being a place that was known for its cannabis production long before legalization in California. And that drove, you know, and was kind of part and parcel of a rural back to the land movement. A lot of people, younger people leaving the cities and setting up homesteads in rural Humboldt back in the late 60s and 70s. These people, a lot of them were living off the grid by necessity. And so because of that, Humboldt County at one time had the highest percentage of residential solar electric systems of any place in California. And, you know, it was sort of the you know, necessity is the mother of invention there. The logs there represent our timber economy. Humboldt County is the largest forest products producing county out of all the California counties, and that's definitely a large part of our economy, and I'll talk about how that intersects with our energy economy in a few minutes. The cow represents our kind of conventional agriculture sector. We have a lot of dairy farms along the coast in the Eel River Valley, mainly in the Mad River bottoms further north. That's a really important part and represents sort of an untapped local renewable energy resource in the form of dairy manure biogas, which is something we hope to tap into but haven't really yet. The fishing boat off the coast there represents our struggling but hanging in there fishing industry. You know, challenged with a lot of things like the crab season getting skewed with the domoic acid problem and things like that. The fishing population is important to our energy development also in a way that I'll touch on later in the presentation. Next slide. One thing about our geographic and physical isolation from the rest of the state that manifests itself in us being sort of an energy island. So this graph illustrates how that's a challenge for us. If you look at our peak electric demand, it's you know, between 150 and 200 megawatts. Our average demand is well over 100 megawatts. With the level of enrollment that we have in our Community Choice Energy program, the program itself has experienced so far a peak upwards of 130 megawatts of load. But if you look at our import and export transmission capacity, that's mostly in the form of some lines that go straight east out of our county and connect to the north-south spine of the California grid over near Redding. And you can see that's much smaller. That's in the neighborhood of 70 megawatts. So by necessity, most of our electricity needs have to be met through local resources here in Humboldt County. It's conceivable that we could upgrade that transmission capacity, and if we pursue some of our dreams of being a net exporter of renewable energy, it will be necessary to upgrade that capacity. But for the time being, this is what we've got. That transmission corridor goes across some of the most rugged landscape in California. So doing upgrades to it is going to be costly. Next slide, please. The photo here is a little bit misleading in the sense that, as I've already mentioned, our CEA is organizationally larger than our Community Choice Aggregation program. We have in this photo more than 20 people. In total staff, including all our interns and everything, we're in the neighborhood of 30 people. But as far as the people who run the Community Choice program from day to day, there's just 4 of us who are doing that full time. We have administrative support in terms of payroll and purchasing and contract support and things like that from a larger team. And we also have a lot of contracted support. So we have an outside call center that is run for us by Calpine Energy Solutions. Calpine also provides our billing interface with PG&E, so all that electronic data interchange is done through Calpine. We also get support on our energy procurement from the Energy Authority, which is a nonprofit that mostly serves municipal utilities across the country. They're based in Jacksonville, Florida, and their regional office that we do most of our work with is up in Bellevue, Washington. So if you just picture like a small subset of those people there that are cranking away on the CCA stuff all day long, including me, and then the rest of the people surrounding us either working on other programs like our energy efficiency service, as some of them up on ladders every day changing light bulbs and things like that. Others providing all that administrative backbone that we all need to run our programs. Our CCA, I'm happy to say, has a 93% participation rate. You're probably aware that in California, CCAs are set up as opt-out programs, which means that when the program launches, that everyone is given a notification the program is launching. If they don't request otherwise, they're enrolled in the program. They're sent multiple mailers letting them know that they have choices, including staying with the investor-owned utility. But we did a really thorough community outreach campaign before, during, and after launching. And I'm happy with the results that we've got well over 90% of the community in our program. That consists of a little over 60,000 customer accounts. As I mentioned before, about 130 megawatt peak load, about 700,000 megawatt hours a year of energy sales. Our local load growth is modest. We're expecting continued growth around 1% annually. We're different from most of California in that with our cool coastal climate, we don't really have air conditioning. So our load actually tends to be winter peaking since some households are using electricity for space heating. Next slide. So here's just an overview of what our power sources have been. Most of our power is coming from outside of Humboldt County at this time, and a fair chunk of it is even coming from outside of California. We are getting a substantial portion of our energy from wind energy contracts up in Oregon and Washington. We've been getting solar from a large solar project in the Southern California desert. We've been getting a lot of hydro, which is large hydro, so it's not renewable in the eyes of California's regulatory system, but it is considered carbon-free energy. And then the biomass, which is the one substantial portion of our energy that we're procuring locally at this time. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Next slide. So a breakdown of it, the right-hand side of the slide here of the graph, the green and yellow slices represent what part of our portfolio is in satisfying the California Renewable Portfolio Standard. So we're getting about a quarter of our energy through locally procured biomass under 2 contracts that we have with local producers. We are getting some of it from wind, and we had one substantial contract that was a kind of fungible wind plus geothermal contract, and a fairly small slice of it from solar. That hydropower that's not RPS but is carbon-free makes up a really big chunk of it. So in 2018, we had in excess of 80% of our total portfolio renewable and or carbon-free. The system power is also sometimes called brown power. This is the part that is not readily traceable to a specific source, tends to be mostly natural gas-fired energy here in California, with some of it coming from other hydro sources and some other resources. We do specifically have a policy of not procuring nuclear. Next slide. So community choice can mean a lot of different things at different levels. There's the choice of a community to start one of these programs in the first place. There's choices that the community makes through, typically through the CCA's board of directors about what that energy portfolio looks like, which was what we were just looking at in the last slide. And then there's choices that the individual customers get to make. And so in this case, we have two different program offerings. What people got enrolled in by default is the center bar in the graph here. So roughly 40% renewable. We do have an opt-up option people can choose, our Repower Plus option, which is 100% renewable. And that compares with the current PG&E mix, which is just at about 1/3 renewable currently. And in terms of rates, we currently have our rates set 3% below PG&E. Because of some financial challenges that we're facing with PG&E planning to reduce their generation rates in the near future, and also the power charge indifference adjustment, which is the exit fee that people have to pay to the utility for their stranded costs if they join a CCA program. We're facing a more challenging financial situation in 2019 than we did last year. And after looking at our options, our board has decided for the time being to reduce our rate discount to be just 1% below PG&E's rates. We don't know the exact date that we're going to make that change yet, because PG&E's rate changes are on hold right now, but probably in May or at the latest June, we would be adjusting our rates to make that discount a little bit smaller. We hope to go back to a larger discount by 2020, based on our current projections of where the financial curve is headed. People who want to choose the Repower Plus just pay 1 cent more than they would pay for the Repower program. So that's pretty simple math when you're talking to people about their rates and they're trying to decide whether to opt up. It's just a penny more per kilowatt hour. Next slide. All right, now we'll dive into looking at some of these projects that we're taking on to start building our local renewable energy portfolio. So first of them is a microgrid project being developed at our local regional airport, which is about 20 miles north of Eureka here. This is the Arcata Eureka Airport. This project is really innovative. We have PG&E as a partner in it. The technical lead on it is the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University, which happens to be where I previously worked. PG&E is going to own and operate the distribution infrastructure, part of this microgrid. The actual generation and energy storage resources are going to be owned and operated by us, our CEA. It's a real critical facility because of being the airport and also having a Coast Guard installation that provides search and rescue operations for a long stretch of coast north and south of us. So high reliability electricity is really important here. So the opportunity to build a solar system that is putting power into the grid and supporting the on-site loads here was really attractive to us. The funding for this is coming partly from the California Energy Commission through their Electric Program Investment Charge, or EPIC, grant program. and the remainder of the costs are going to be paid through ratepayer money from RCEA. In the near term, we're financing that through a loan from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service. Next slide, please. So this system is going to be really innovative because for PG&E it will be their first wholesale microgrid operating in the wholesale power market. In other words, the generation assets are mostly going to be located on the utility side of the meter, and any power that's coming off of that system that's not used on site will be sold into the power market through the California Independent System Operator. There is a separate, smaller PV system. So the main system is going to be 2 megawatts, coupled with 8 megawatt hours of battery storage. There's also going to be EV charging component to the project on site at the airport. There's a smaller, more conventional net-metered PV array that will be built as part of the project as well. And the purpose of that system is just to meet on-site loads. And that's also sort of an in lieu payment to the county, which owns the airport, rather than us making a cash payment to them for a land lease of the PV site. We're just providing them with this separate net metered array to offset their own electric loads. So in normal operation, this system will be feeding power into the grid, but it will be able to operate in an islanded mode when the grid is down. And as I mentioned, that's really important because of these critical loads that are located at the airport. Next slide, please. Another area that's even more of a stretch for us in terms of innovation is offshore wind energy for the county. This platform that you see in the photo here is the technology of Principal Power, which is a California-based company that has been one of the world leaders on developing floating offshore wind platforms. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that our coast is attractive for this is that the northernmost California coast and southernmost Oregon coast have some of the best wind anywhere on or around the North American continent. The challenge in taking advantage of that is that we also have a very narrow continental shelf. So compared to places like the North Sea off of Denmark and the Netherlands and Germany, which has kind of been the birthplace of offshore wind energy globally, they have very shallow seas there. So putting in fixed bottom platforms similar to those used for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea has kind of been the most feasible approach there. And likewise, the east coast of the U.S. has a shallower off-sea seabed or offshore seabed. So the very first offshore wind project has recently been commissioned and put into operation off of Rhode Island, and that's the Block Island project. And that, like those projects in Northern Europe, is a fixed bottom project. But because the waters get so deep so fast as you go off the west coast of the U.S., the platforms to capture those strong winds need to be a few miles offshore, and putting fixed bottom platforms out there where the water is several hundred or even more than 1,000 feet deep is just not feasible. So floating platform technology really is needed here. Next slide, please. So the federal and state governments really want to see offshore wind develop off the California coast, and we have alliances happening with those state and federal agencies to make that happen. The floating wind technology has already had a chance to prove itself. Their Principal Power, the company I mentioned previously, deployed a floating platform off the coast of Portugal and kept that out in the sea for about 5 years and generated energy successfully with it, ran it through some really rough seas over that time and decommissioned it safely and brought it back ashore. So they've basically tested the whole life cycle of this technology. So from a technology standpoint, we're convinced that it's ready to go. Another company, Equinor, has recently done a 5 turbine platform project off the coast of Scotland. So it's happening. It's ready for prime time now. One challenge that California is facing is that the Department of Defense stepped in and opined that most of the California coast is unsuitable for offshore wind because they see it as being in conflict with the Navy's needs and operations. So they've published this map here that redlines a large part of the California coast. The sort of accidental good news for Humboldt County that comes out of this is that we're one of the small parts of the coast that the Department of Defense doesn't see a challenge with. So as a result, the companies interested in offshore wind development have been turning their attention more to the North Coast. Plus, like as I mentioned earlier, the resource is the best here. This is just a kind of a schematic view of what this technology looks like. You've got these floating turbines. You've got electric cables connecting them all together, get kind of the equivalent of what in a solar system would be called a combiner box, which in this case is a much larger scale, but it's an offshore substation that pulls together the power from all those turbines. And then you've got a down on or under the seabed, a cable coming ashore to bring the power to an onshore substation. The reason I'm focusing on principal power here is that our CEA initially was approached by Principal Power. We had a mutual interest in developing offshore wind. We first entered into a non-binding memorandum of understanding with them to just explore the possibility. Once we started seeing that this was something we wanted to move forward with, we decided to enter into an open competitive solicitation process to identify the best company to work with. We put together a review team representing all different stakeholders across our community, and as well as some outside expertise and even another CCA that was interested in this to the south of us. And through this competitive process, we selected a consortium of companies that includes Principal Power to work with us on developing the renewable power opportunity with offshore wind. So we're now in the process of setting up a public-private partnership to continue working with that consortium. Next slide, please. So the project that we're looking at would be we're calling it a demonstration scale project. It's a bit smaller than what the offshore wind companies would really like to develop for sort of optimum economic return on their investment. But we feel that we need to start with a smallish project that won't face too many permitting hurdles and won't make our stakeholders too nervous. And hopefully we can prove the technology at this scale and then scale it up further down the road. So for the time being, we're looking at a project that would deploy 10 to 15 turbines. These would be really large turbines, probably upwards of 10 megawatts per turbine. So we're looking at a probably 100 or so megawatt scale project. There's some port infrastructure that needs to be done onshore here, which would have spillover benefits for other industries here. We've currently got a lease application in for the site where we'd like to develop this project with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the federal agency. So this is out in federal waters. We also have an interconnection study underway with the California Independent System Operator and PG&E to see about the feasibility of tying this into the grid and what the transmission and distribution upgrade costs would be associated with that. With all this in mind and all of the environmental review and all the different agencies that we're going to have to get sign off on this, we're looking at probably something like a 7-year process from now till we actually have power generating out in the water, but we got to start somewhere. So here we go. Next slide. All right, so this is a map of the lease area that was submitted to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We initially submitted this as an unsolicited request for lease, which means that at the time that we submitted it, the BOEM had not yet actually issued any kind of call for lease proposals. And we were hoping that we could follow that pathway that would have kept our costs and the time for developing the project to a minimum. After we submitted the lease proposal, BOEM decided to go ahead and do a competitive call for leases. So at this time, we've resubmitted our materials and are part of that competitive process early on in it. So we don't really even know who the competition is yet, if any, and we'll just have to see where this goes. There was just a competitive offshore wind lease process that BOEM did off the East Coast, and it was very competitive. And the federal government is raising hundreds of millions of dollars through the lease bids they got through that. So we got a glimpse of how costly this could be to do this off the West Coast if there's a similar level of interest, but that remains to be seen. Next slide, please. I want to finish up our overview of some of our local renewable resources with one where there's already quite a bit of steel in the ground in the form of local biomass power. So as I mentioned, we're a leading forest products producing county. There's long been the need to deal with the waste, all the sawdust and chips and bark and everything that come from processing logs, dating back to the 1980s and the era when there were a lot of qualifying facilities being set up under PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act. That manifested itself in a number of biomass power plants being set up in Humboldt County. There are 3 of those plants. 2 of them are currently operating under contract to our program. The 3rd plant is offline at this time. This is important to us as a resource for our program, mainly because among the renewable options that we have access to, this one is not an intermittent resource. This is one that's base load. So like other types of thermal plants, we can count on a pretty steady output from these plants. Having outside of the needs of our program, if you look at the broader community needs, there is a waste management problem that's being solved by keeping these plants in operation. Biomass power has proven itself more expensive than other renewable resources as solar and wind have come down in price over the years. So it has been at a premium cost that we've chosen to procure this power resource, but looking at all the upsides of it for the community, our board has determined that at least part of our portfolio should come from this resource. As I mentioned earlier, it's about 1/4 of our total procurement. There is some controversy locally on this. We've had some community activists that have come to our board with concerns about the local air pollutants released by these plants, as well as the carbon emissions and the desire to really get to a carbon-free resource. It's a long and complicated discussion. The state of California does not consider burning of biomass power to be counted as carbon emissions, given the fact that it's seen as kind of a closed cycle where this is a resource that where the carbon can be taken back up by the plants, and this is more of a closed loop rather than fossil fuels where you're digging and drilling stuff out of the ground and putting that carbon into the atmosphere that would otherwise stay sequestered. Anyway, a long ongoing discussion in the community about the merits of including biomass in our portfolio, but at least for the time being, this is contributing to our resource mix and also providing some local skilled blue-collar jobs. Next slide, please. So that's really the end of the material I wanted to talk about. I did want to just spend a minute talking about this photo here. This is an aerial photo of Humboldt Bay and the entrance to Humboldt Bay, and you can see the city of Eureka in the upper left part of the photo. This is a vintage photo. This dates back at least 20 years when there were still 2 large pulp mills operating on the Samoa Peninsula adjacent to Eureka. And you can see this plume. There really was a substantial air pollution problem associated with those mills when they were operating. They've since both closed down. One of the sites of one of those mills is now being considered for a large land-based aquaculture project, which, if built, could represent just this one facility would be so large that it would increase our total electricity load for the county by as much as 10 to 15%. So it's really substantial opportunity for the county and would really grow our customer base. I also just look at this picture and think about how bad Eureka used to smell most of the time when these industrial plants were operating, and I'm really happy to see us moving towards cleaner industries today. The one biomass plant that is just barely visible at the far left of this photo is still operating today, but is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the pollutants those pulp mills used to put into the air. Also looking at the entrance to Humboldt Bay, and you'll note that all the way from the bay entrance to the ocean, all the way out to the city of Eureka and where the port facilities are, there are no bridges here, which is kind of a unique thing among West Coast ports, and deploying those large offshore wind platforms out into the ocean. One of the reasons that Humboldt Bay is of interest to these wind companies is because the lack of bridges there really simplifies the deployment of that hardware out into the ocean. So there's a lot of energy-related stories embedded in this one historic photo here. Just wanted to share that, and I thank you for your interest in our CEA and our CCA program, and I'm happy to take any questions that have come in.
Well, thank you, Richard. That was terrific. I do see one question here, probably more related to Oregon, from Angela Crowley-Coach of OSEA. Good morning, Angela. Are you worried about the possibility of rising exit fees as other CCAs in California have seen? Well, indeed, that's one of the things we hope to do in Oregon here, is to learn from California's lesson. There are a lot of things that we can take from California that are pretty amazing, and I think as we've seen in this presentation, but there are some things that were done early in California's effort that maybe could have been thought through more thoroughly around exit fees, stranded costs, and that sort of thing. So certainly in our bill that we have out there, that we are trying to think through that. I can certainly talk offline in much more detail, but yeah, that is something that we're trying to take a lesson from here, from our friends in California that really kind of shown us the way. Oh, and then maybe a question for you, Richard. A question from Sean. I'm not sure I can see that. Who sets the price on the power from the microgrid, and does the RCA have a set price contract to be taken for the power off taker, and who is contracted to take the power from the airport project?
Great, yeah, thank you. Good morning, Sean. TEA, the Energy Authority, who is already, as I mentioned, a service provider for us and does our scheduling for those two biomass plants, will also be doing the scheduling for the microgrid. So they're one of our partners on that project, in addition to the contractual services they already provide us. Let's see, I was able to see the question a minute ago. Let's see if I can. I think I can scroll back through the questions here, right? Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, just working with the interface here. Yes, RCEA PG&E will still be the owner of the asset here, and we've actually been working on this question of how the actual microgrid controls will work, and we've settled on a solution where there will actually be two microgrid controllers. RCEA will have control through TEA of a controller that will kind of optimize the daily discharge and charge of the batteries to try to take advantage of the we call it arbitrage on the power market, basically, you know, buy low, sell high. So we won't actually be charging the microgrid off the grid, but we will be using the solar resource to charge the batteries, and then selling some of that battery storage as prices dictate into the grid. But PG&E needs to maintain control to the extent that this is part of their distribution network, and so they kind of have final say-so over connecting and disconnecting from the grid in terms of outage cycles and things. Just the things that PG&E already has control over on the grid, they're going to continue to exercise that control. So we're still kind of working out the nuances of this, but at kind of a high schematic level, we have an agreement to have two separate controls, ours being sort of the economic-based controller, and PG&E's being kind of the operational needs-based controller, if you will.
And do you see the next question there, Richard, from Mark Smith about daily power scheduling and reliability planning services?
Let's see. Okay, I think actually I spilled over into answering part of that question. I thought I was still looking at Sean's question. Apologies, Sean. Let me double back first to Sean's question because I didn't capture all of that. As far as who sets the price on the power generated from the microgrid, so because this is a pilot project and because we're in a sense kind of imposing the project on the retail customers, we've decided that we're going to develop experimental tariffs with PG&E, and we've actually just set up our working group with PG&E and some other stakeholders to go through that process. But we are not going to actually impact the energy prices from what they would otherwise be for these customers. We are going, as part of the tariff development, because the generation and storage assets will be owned by RCEA, we need to work with PG&E in the months ahead. It's still about 2 years from now until this whole system will be built and operational, but during that time period, we're going to be working with PG&E to develop an experimental tariff, and we'll be taking this to the CPUC for review. That will be a cost recovery tariff for RCEA, through which we can recover the costs of building and operating our renewable energy infrastructure from PG&E when the grid is in islanded mode. So these times when PG&E would otherwise just be saying to their customers, sorry, no power, they will be able to continue providing power thanks to our resources. So there will be a cost recovery component to the tariff in that. Normally, we would also be, and we expect as this technology gets replicated elsewhere, that in a commercial setting, that the customers would pay something extra for the reliability they get of having power service when the main grid goes down. But under this experimental model, we're not planning to charge customers anything extra for that reliability benefit. Okay, so I think I already tackled Mark's question. As far as RCA interfacing with CAISO, yeah, we do interface directly with CAISO, and that's the grid scheduling function that the Energy Authority plays for us.
So, Richard, I see we've got a couple more questions, but I know we're coming up on the end of our time here, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time that's on. So I can reach out directly to some of these folks to answer their questions. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. And yes, we'll circle back with folks on these questions they put in here. Thanks again for your questions. And thanks to everybody for attending. We hope you found this useful. Please follow up with any follow-up questions after this to myself directly. Happy to answer those. Just want to let you know about a couple of upcoming webinars we've got. Tuesday, April 9th, 10 o'clock, a CCA perspective on diversity, equity, inclusion. And then on 10 a.m. May 14th is how some CCAs in California are getting to 100% renewable, not in 2030, not in 2035, but in 2019. And we are looking to iron out some of the details, but we are also hoping to have a webinar in June around CCA, electric vehicles, and advanced transportation. So with that, my contact information there at the bottom. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Alan.